I put a pair of glasses in there in case you don't have glasses with you.
Okay.
Hello, chaps. A moment of silence, please. The proceedings are just about to begin. Anyway, so tonight we have the pleasure of entertaining Elizabeth Kooy, and the topic is the question of the juvenile justice system and its necessary reform. The particular focus is on the problem of having juveniles charged as adults and tried as adults. And so she's been at this for over 2 decades, and so I think tonight she has a lot to tell us. This meeting is number 438. It started with Jim over there and Tom got together about 9 years ago now. So.
Yeah, 9.
And so you know, so we welcome you here tonight, and I'm sure Elizabeth will be fully informative of it. And I don't think, since no one's new, I don't have to go through the rigmarole of the rules.
That's cool.
So we'll skip that. Fine, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Liz Kooy. I'm a social worker, and I've worked for just over 2 decades with kids who are in trouble with the law. We call them children who get in trouble. But also I have a special interest in kids who are tried as adults. I started off in January in 1998. I was in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, and I was assigned to the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic, which is the legal aid clinic. The legal aid clinic in the University of Chicago Law School. So I was assigned to a case of a 15-year-old boy named Douglas who was supposedly the state thought that he was standing 2 blocks away while 2 other boys were shot and killed 2 other rival gang members. He was 15 years old and he was being faced with life without the possibility of parole. He was automatically tried as an adult, and then he was automatically, if he was found guilty, he was going to be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. I was a little outraged that our government would take away a 15-year-old's life for standing 2 blocks away in a really terrible incident, but and participating at some level. But I decided that was it. I was going to start working on juveniles tried as adults, and so since then, 1998, I have been kind of helping to reform the system all throughout, mostly in Illinois, but all throughout the country. So I'm going to talk to you about that. In 1998, as a social work student, I couldn't get one single person to agree with me that kids should not be tried as adults. And I hope that in 21 years I'm able to convince all you guys instead of, we'll see if I've done anything good. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about juvenile justice and how we got started in that, and then I'm going to talk to you about how we got kids out of the juvenile court and how we started charging kids as adults. I'm going to talk about kids that serve life without the possibility of parole, and a little tiny bit of brain development, some fun stuff about that. Of course, then questions and answers, and then I hear you guys all get up and try and argue with me. I'm very excited about that. We'll see that. So the juvenile court started off in Illinois in 1899. And it was run by do-gooders or social workers, and they really wanted to just mold kids into better behavior. They were never going to actually work with kids who got in serious trouble with the law. They wanted to just make kids do better things. So it was mostly about immigrant children at the time, in 1899, when the social workers started. It was never intended to keep all kids, though. They always expected to have some kids charged in the adult system. The first transfers to adult court were actually in 1903, so 4 years after the juvenile court started, and they were drive-by shootings. So obviously in 1903 there were no cars, but there were horses, and there were sawed-off shotguns, and there were 6 kids who got charged in an adult court that year in Chicago for driving by. So I spent a long time in juvenile court where it was a lot of where they were trying to, be parents to children and trying to, reshape their lives. And in 1967, we ended up putting in protections for kids. It was a court case called Henry Galt, and Gerald Galt was actually charged with making a lewd phone call to a woman, and she got upset about this. said some nasty words to her on the phone, and she called the cops, and the cops arrested him, and they put him in like a detention center, jail kind of place for 6 months to a year, and he had no attorney. He was never allowed to like confront her. Maybe he didn't make the phone call. I'd like to think that we're a little bit better than that, but it's not true. We actually still do that kind of crazy stuff where we take kids. They now get attorneys, but somebody makes a bad phone call, sometimes people get a little upset about it. Still to this day, which is crazy. So kids that started in 1967 got the right to counsel. They got the right to confront their witnesses, same as adults. But that did not start until 1967, and we ushered in a bunch of lawyers working in the court system. Once the lawyers came into the court system instead of the do-gooder social workers, it ended up being a lot of focus more on punishment and focus more on putting people into prisons. So in the 1980s and the 1990s, we really worked hard at building prisons. They became some of our rural communities. They became kind of this was the places where people had jobs. It was an economic development.
Right.
You would build a prison or you'd build a detention center, and everybody got jobs down there. So we started building a lot of youth prisons as well and making them more prison-like, and we had a lot of theories about like the rise of a super predator. If you guys remember the super predator words, everybody used it. People got real mad about Hillary Clinton using the word super predator, but I tell you, everybody in the 1990s used the word super predator, and they believed that there was going to be a whole group of kids, young black males, that were going to, destroy the whole fabric of society. It started with a Princeton professor named John DeLulio, and he had made this theory based on there was a spike in crime and birth rates, and this whole crazy theory about why there were going to be all these young children who were going to do all these crazy things in our neighborhoods. It turns out that he, was basing some of his statistics on a little bit of strange, not necessarily accurate statistics. We have something called the Uniform Crime Reporting, and Uniform Crime Report, and we end up, they're called UCR codes, and we have something where we try to determine how much crime is out there. So in the early 80s, they switched the category of assault became a violent crime instead of a non-violent crime. And so when they switched it, it looked kind of like there was a spike in violent crime, but there wasn't actually a spike in violent crime. It just turns out that they changed the categories. So we have to laugh at that. So a lot of moral panic ensued, though, in the 1990s. If you remember, Central Park 5 was a really big, huge deal where the 5 boys were charged as adults, and they confessed, and they were, supposedly had raped a woman and almost killed her in Central Park. She was a jogger. And then, of course, it turns out that that didn't really happen, and it wasn't them. They falsely confessed, and they've gotten a lot of money out of the state of New York now. So none of that was true. We had a situation in Chicago as well where we had a group of teenage boys, 13, 14, 15, and 16-year-olds that supposedly had raped and killed a Rush, her name was Lori Rossetti, and she was a Rush Presbyterian medical student, and she was brutally raped and murdered, and they blamed 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old boys. They came in, they charged them as adults, and they got sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, and then it turns out 15 years later, the DNA matched somebody else, and they got out. This is a theme that kind of happens a lot. In Chicago as well, we had a 7 and 8-year-old that were charged with rape and murder of an 11-year-old girl. And lo and behold, at least that only lasted about a month before they figured out that it was actually somebody else. But this is kind of a theme that ends up happening, and the media kind of takes over, and that's how we get this idea that they're super predators, because we hear these stories that turn out later to be maybe false, but we hear these stories about these terrible incidences, and then we have this vision that there are lots of kids who are committing these kinds of crimes. So we started to transfer a lot of kids to adult court. We made it really, really easy for states to do that. Every state has a different criminal justice system, so every state gets to make their own laws and decide how they're going to do it. Every state has a very complicated statute on how to get there. Texas is very complicated, Illinois, everywhere in here, and none of it follows the same thing. So you could be charged in Texas with something and stay in the juvenile court. You could be charged in Oklahoma with the same thing and then be charged as an adult. It just depends on where you are, but all 50 states have a different system. And again, we had a big, huge increase in prisons where they built prisons and detention centers. And the rule is, if you build it, they will come. Eventually, states will put in more and more laws to fill up those detention centers and prisons. It's hard for people to argue to close a prison when it's an economic development, livelihood for a bunch of people in a place. So it became a little too crazy. So in the 2000s and 2010s, right where we are right now, we started to see some rollback of some of these harsher, more punitive approaches. We started to work on the transfer to adult court, where we started to pull back and move some of these. One of the main ways we get kids as charged as adults is we just lower the age of when you can be charged as a child in juvenile court or when you can be charged as an adult. So in New York, for example, all 16, 17-year-olds were always just automatically charged as adults. In Illinois, all 17-year-olds were charged as adults. In Texas right now, still to this day, 17-year-olds are all charged as adults. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing here in Texas, trying to change that in a few minutes. So we no longer now look at some things as super predators either. We kind of see that they're not necessarily, that was not really what was happening, and we kind of have this vision of children that's not quite accurate. So sometimes we can even close some prisons. I know I said that it's really hard to close prisons, and it is, but sometimes we can actually do it, and we've been able to. Usually what happens is they get upset because somebody's going to lose their job, but we've been able to remold some of them. We've closed a youth prison, a really bad youth prison in Illinois, and made it into an adult prison. Sometimes we can just close them all together and repurpose them into schools. So how did we get to this crazy crisis level? We stopped treating our kids as kids. We forgot that they were children. We started bringing younger and younger kids in, thinking because we had these places to put them and we could start, maybe helping them. And then we started, lowering the age and just making kids be adults earlier and earlier in their lives. We also forgot this really important thing in the juvenile justice. We all know this, and we all know this kind of intuitively. If you do absolutely nothing with a kid who gets in trouble with the law, the likelihood that they will reoffend is very, very low, actually. Usually you have to do nothing, and then they kind of stop doing some of their craziness. We kind of know that if you have a crazy brother, he started acting up, and eventually he stops acting up, right? So we kind of know this intuitively, but we kind of forgot that for a long time. So here we now have 5 states left that charge children under the age of 18 as adults automatically. So Texas at 17 years old. Since 2007, most of the states that have been doing that have made changes. So Illinois made changes starting in 2007, Connecticut, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Mississippi, all these places have changed to raise the age to 18 to make it more in line with what the other parts of our laws say. In 2007, we saw approximately 195,000 children that were excluded from the adult courts. Most of those would have, this is just based on age limits, most of them would have adult records for the rest of their lives based on that. Sometimes they were as young as 15 years old. In 2010, because of some of the changes, that went down to about 137,000 kids, but still a lot of kids each year are being charged as adults. The last 2 states to raise the age were New York, and that will go into effect in 2019, where kids that are 16 and 17 will then be tried as juveniles instead of adults, and then North Carolina as well. So last session, in 2017, was the last time we got to go down to Austin and argue with our lovely state representatives and senators and try to put bills in. They have a very short session every 2 years, right? So we only have 6 months. It starts in January, ends in June. And we put it in a bill in 2017, House Bill 122, Representative Dutton out of Houston actually put in a bill to raise the age to 18. Got a lot of bipartisan support in the House. It passed a pretty good majority of people actually said that they wanted to do that. Some of the arguments against raising the age is it's going to cost too much money. We heard the same thing in Illinois, they heard the same thing in Mississippi, they heard the same thing all over the country. Whenever you try to raise the age, most people will say that to their state reps, it's going to cost too much money, we can't do it. What we found in the other places is that it absolutely did not cost a lot of money to do that. It was just something that they would say to try not to raise the age. So it was never called in the Senate last time, and we're hoping that here in 2019, I know it's going to be refiled, and we're hoping to have a bigger push and try and raise that age, because that will, I think we'll be able to, at least get all the 17-year-old kids back under the juvenile court where they have potential to actually not have adult waivers for the rest of their lives. So again, this is not a new phenomenon. Kids have been tried as adults since the beginning, but we end up transferring kids by the kids who are actually, when they go from a juvenile court judge and go to the adult court, or a prosecutor decides, we find that we really just charge the black and brown youth way more than we would white kids. So it's usually very overrepresentative for minority youth that happens when we do that. Each state is so complicated that we also end up putting in laws that make it so that it's easier for some kids to get there. In Illinois, we had a situation where if you were within 1,000 feet of a school or a public housing project, you were going to be automatically tried as an adult if you had any drugs on you. And so in Chicago, you can't go 1,000 feet without running into a school. There's schools everywhere, right? So, but in suburbs, there's no, you could be very far and you would not be charged as an adult. So we decided we wanted to try children as adults is because we wanted punishment in juvenile court was not going to be severe enough, or that they needed to protect the public because these kids were doing these really crazy things, or that the kids had already been through the juvenile court so many times, and then they were intractable, and there was no way they were ever going to improve, and so we might as well just put them in the adult system. That's what we've always said, but I'll tell you, none of that ever bears out in research. Whenever you look at what happens, none of that is true. It's more that it's politically correct to always vote for more and more harsher punishments, right? I mean that by, no politician's going to lose their jobs by, making it harsher on children. We had a lot of people that would say that if we charge kids as adults, it will solve the gang problem because gangs were using younger kids to do their dirty work. But that never really kind of got out to the gang members. So the little children on the street didn't know that this was happening, so they would just do whatever they were going to do, and next thing you know, they would be charged as adults. I argue actually that the only reason why we do this is because we like these 3 words, the 3 R words: retribution, retaliation, and revenge. And that's why we actually charge kids as adults. So there's many different ways that you can be charged as adults. You can have a mandatory waiver depending on what you do. You could have a judicial waiver where the judge would actually decide that you need to go, but he has to go based on certain points. You could have a discretionary, the presumptive, there's all different ways, we have all different rules. And then they also just have automatic, so if you're charged with a certain crime, you would just automatically be an adult. We have things where a prosecutor can decide, depending on where you are and what state you're in. They literally have a book with over 100 pages, 2 pages each state, trying to explain their complicated statutes on how to charge children as adults. Sometimes if you've once been charged as an adult, you've always been charged, and then we have these things where sometimes you'll be charged as a juvenile and get a juvenile sentence. If you don't do well, then you also have to do an adult sentence after that. All very complicated. The first time I started working on this was in 2001, and we looked at a year's worth of data, and we had 393 kids in Chicago that were charged as adults. There were 3 white kids out of that 393. 66% of them were charged with simple drug crimes, 4% with guns in schools, which I know is very scary. I agree, but kids in Chicago have guns in schools, but kids also down in lower parts of Illinois would also have guns in schools, and they would be totally separated. The kids that were downstate would get much easier punishment. The kids that were in Chicago would be much harsher punishment. So only 26% of those kids were considered violent offenders. And again, it was very much heavily skewed towards African American youth. There were only 3 white kids in the entire thing. 13% of the kids were Latino. So in 2001, I went down to Springfield, Illinois to argue that their laws were racist. And I was young and dumb, as George W. Bush has said before, I'm young and dumb. So I thought for sure that they were going to listen to me, because if you tell somebody that their laws are racist, they're going to change it, right? They did not approve of what I was saying. They were not happy with me. And they laughed me out and they said, we don't care, these kids are terrible children, they're clearly selling drugs, we don't care, this is a terrible thing, we don't mind, doing this. And we lost very big. I drove all the way back from Springfield to Chicago, which is a 3-hour, really lonely highway. I'm thinking, wow, I thought I really did a good job explaining how bad this was. So anyway, but that was my first experience, and now I realize that it doesn't matter what state you go in, it's going to be the exact same people that are running. I can go to Austin and argue the exact same thing, and I get the exact same feedback. It's not about that. But we've, since 2001, in Illinois alone, we've been able to roll back the number of transfers. So now we have, we used to have a page full of each different ways, small print, and now we only have 6 different ways in Illinois to be able to charge kids as adults, which is really good. So I thought I would talk to you a little tiny bit about some of the automatic transfer cases and kids and how they, what their backgrounds are. I'll give you a few examples of some of the kids I've worked with. I had a kid named Michael. Way back when in the day, he was 16 years old, and he was accused of stealing a 1972 Chevy Valant from some white people were in his neighborhood, and they were buying drugs, and they were high on drugs as well. But he supposedly taken their car, and he was 16 years old, and he supposedly took the car with some 35-year-old and a 29-year-old man, which makes not very much sense because a 16-year-old boy not hanging. Anyway, so he also says, Michael's very funny, he says, I would never steal a 1972 Chevy Valant. Who would do that? That's crazy, right? These cars are not the greatest cars. But anyway, Michael was charged as an adult automatically, and they had messed up some of his birth date stuff, so he was in a really bad area of the jail as a 16-year-old boy, which was it was crazy. You couldn't get him out. He was really doing very poorly. But Michael's, his whole story is he was over at his girlfriend's house, and he was going to her, and the cops just walked in. He was, at midnight trying to meet up with his girlfriend and snuck out of his own home, and the cops walked in, and they saw him standing there, and they grabbed him, and they did what they call a show up to the people that had gotten their car stolen, and they walked up and they said, is this the guy? And these people said, yeah, that's the guy. And so next thing you know, his 2 co-defendants, the 29-year-old and the 35-year-old, both said that it wasn't him. Both came in, and one came into court and said this is not him, and you know what? The jury did not care. The jury found him guilty. Next thing you know, he was going to spend, we got him to have a 9-year sentence, but he was originally supposed to spend closer to 30 years in prison for that. Nothing you could do. Michael was the sweetest guy. He hated me. Every day he would say, he was like, ugh, I hate your clothes. You look ridiculous. Okay, whatever. I'm trying to help you. Come on. So Michael would say all these things. He lived with his grandmother and his great-grandmother, and so that's why he was able to sneak out of the house, since they were not necessarily supervising clothes that they should have. But Michael's mother was murdered when he was 3 years old, and so he grew up without a mother, and his father was never really around. He had a pretty, not in the greatest life, and this was definitely one of those situations where he, found himself in a bad situation and was unable to get out of it. So he hated me, I thought, and then when he left and was in prison, he sent me a nice letter asking me if I ever decided I didn't want to be with my husband anymore, he'd be happy to marry me. All right, I got a 16-year-old boy. It was very cute. Anyway, so that was one of my cases, and it was a real tragedy because he was, he ended up going to prison, and it's really hard once you go to prison and you have a felony conviction to ever get out of that. The next thing you know, he tried to do a lot of stuff, it just nothing would ever work. He couldn't get into schools because he had this felony conviction, he couldn't really get a job, and so he's always struggled ever since then. And I'm firmly convinced that it wasn't him. I'm firmly convinced because I begged him to just take whatever deal they would give him because I didn't want to see the ending where he would end up going to prison, and he ended up going to prison. I've also worked with a kid named Steven who, and a lot of people get real nervous about sex offenses. Everybody's real high on those, that they're real worried about, and I think that they're terrible too, but we always tend to over-prosecute sex offenses, and once you're charged and you are going to go to an adult court, so he was accused of having sex with an 11-year-old boy when he was 15, which should never have done. Absolutely, should not have done it. But he was facing a mandatory minimum of about 18 to 25 years in prison. He, you know, again, he did not have the easiest of lives. He was the Child Protective Services, was a ward of the state, and a lot of issues with that. But a really good kid, and we worked really hard, and we were able to get him so that the judge found it so that he was not found guilty of the adult offense, and then he went to a treatment center until he was 21 years old, and he stayed there and did an incredible job, and they let him out. And he has been working for the city of Chicago for the last 18 years, I think, right now. Never gotten in a bit of trouble again. I get a phone call from him every single, at Thanksgiving, every single, at my birthday, he calls me and says, we have the exact same conversation. He says, you still have your same phone number? I said, yes, I do, right? And he said, I don't know where I'd be without you. And I say, well, you'd be in prison, Stephen, you'd be in prison. That's our phone call over here. That is very nice. I have worked with girls. A lot of people ask me about girls, and girls also get charged as adults, and sometimes they get charged because they do stupid things with their boyfriends. I had a girl named Lourdes who, she and her boyfriend decided to steal a bicycle from an 11-year-old girl, and they, instead of just pushing her off her bike and grabbing the bike and leaving, they decided that they were going to show her a gun and then tell her that they were going to kill her if she didn't give her a bike. So they were facing a mandatory minimum 7 to 21 years in prison. We were able to do a little bit better work for that, but again, sometimes these things we were excessive in our punishment of those kids. So we also, we allow children sometimes as young as 13 to be, maybe even younger in some states, to be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. We have a lot of kids that were, sentenced in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. At some point, we have to realize that the law is finally catching up to what actuaries and rental car companies have known for decades, where they don't allow you to rent a car until you're 25 because they know you're not mature enough to be able to drive a car. So, and the law and what we're now doing is we're recognizing that as well, that your brain is not developed and that children and young adults should not be, don't have the capacity to do that. So, starting in 2002, some of the cases started going through the court system to not allow children to be sentenced to life without possibility of parole. In 2010, the Supreme Court, actually the U.S. Supreme Court found that in a case in Florida that kids who were not charged with homicides could not be sentenced to life without possibility of parole. So if you had been charged and sentenced in some other offense other than a homicide, you could not. And then in 2012, in a case called Miller versus Alabama, they found that even in homicide cases, that they would have to be able to show, and they have to look at and make meaningful, that children can show that they've been rehabilitated or that their circumstances were different so that they shouldn't be sentenced to life without possibility of parole. States all across the country are now abolishing the idea that we could sentence kids, so their state legislatures are actually putting in laws to try and abolish that. So once Miller versus Alabama went through, they had to, some places ended up, they had to start resentencing these kids, because we have about 3,500 kids across the country that are sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, or de facto, where they have so many years that there's no way they're ever going to get out.
How many kids?
3,500. And so some states are much worse than other states, and some places we don't even actually know where how many kids, because depending on how they're sentenced, we don't know how long they're going to be. Like in Texas, you're up for parole after 30 years, depending on what your crime was, but you're technically up for parole, but because of what your crime was, there's no way you're ever going to actually get parole. They just, so we can't really quite count on those people because they're technically up for parole, but they're not really going to ever get out. So some states ended up where governors would just take all the kids that were currently there and then just give them a flat sentence. And because the Supreme Court said you can't do that anymore, you have to, go and look at those kids. Illinois actually started doing resentencing hearings, and they would go in and they would actually have a judge go in and listen and decide how much time you should get. So we have a couple cases I was just going to tell you a little bit about. There was a kid named Adolfo Davis who he was 14 years old, and he was charged as an adult and then sentenced to life without possibility of parole. He actually did really well in prison for a long time. He was doing pretty poorly because he went in when he was 14. But then he started doing really well, and he really improved, and he was really doing great. They had a sentencing hearing for him, and they pointed out all these terrible things that had happened to him, that he was 14, that he was not really seriously involved in the crime as much as they said that he was. And the judge said, even though the Supreme Court has said you cannot sentence kids to life without the possibility of parole, except under very extreme circumstances, she decided that he was one of those kids at 14 years old that needed to go back and spend the rest of his life in prison. So she sentenced him once again to life without the possibility of parole. It was tragic because he was on TV. Everybody thought he was going to get out. It was like one of these poster cases for why we do not send kids to the life without the possibility of parole. And then she said, no, we're going back. So fast forward now, in the last couple of years, they've actually decided with the state's attorney, because there was all these appeals and all these things that they were going to do with it, they gave him a better sentence, and he's going to get out in 2020. So he'll get out in 2 more years. So will have spent about 30 years in prison.
Oh my God.
Before he gets out. I've been working, my first case was with a kid I think I talked to you about, a kid named Douglas. And he had a co-defendant who actually was one of the kids that was supposedly had shot and killed 2 boys when he was 17 years old. And Ken had no family, never saw, went to court every month for 2 years, never once saw any of his family. He had no clothes to wear when he had his trial. It was a very tragic situation. I felt very sorry for him. Of course, I felt sorry for Keith and Tommy who were killed, but I especially felt sorry for a kid who had nobody. And so I ended up starting to send him Christmas cards and letters, and so he's been my pen pal for almost 20 years in prison. It's pretty amazing. So anyway, Ken also had to get a resentencing hearing and went in. We were very fortunate that the judge gave him what will end up being, he'll end up serving 26 years in prison. So he'll be out in about 6 more years, five or 6 more years. So brain development says why we shouldn't actually charge kids as adults, because brains, again, they're not quite developed when they're younger, and when they're teenagers, they're definitely not adults. I know, anybody here who has raised children? Everybody had kids or teenage crazy people where that they're not exactly, they're not playing up here very well. So the reason is the prefrontal cortex is not very well developed. This is the area of your brain that weighs out consequences, long-term consequences. It controls your impulses. It makes you form judgments. And this is extremely underdeveloped in teens, and it doesn't actually get fully developed until you're closer to 25. Then you have something called the nucleus accumbens, which is the seek pleasure and reward center of your brain. And that is very well developed in teenagers. So there's a mismatch because these kids want rewards and they seek pleasure, and yet their brain does not give them good judgment on what they should be doing. That is why we have this. So they also have this misreading of cues. It's why you can be mildly annoyed with your teenager and they think you're extremely angry and yelling at them. And it's like, I just am annoyed with you. They can't quite read all those quite right. And they don't really necessarily understand their long-term consequences of what can happen to them. Like in the moment, they're very emotional and they might be able to, on paper, tell you that something is wrong. But in the moment, they're not able to kind of access that part of their brain that tells them, stop, slow down. This is your emotional center going. Maybe we should rethink these things. The case I was just talking about, Ken, they decided and then went and shot and killed these people in maybe a 3-minute window where they had a chance to stop that. It was a very quick action. It was not a well thought out, 2 weeks in advance, we're going to go do this, and they made plans. It was a very impulsive act that happens. And, it's tragic, obviously, but in cases like this, you can see where their brains haven't quite caught up to, yeah, they probably know it's wrong, but they haven't had time to kind of think through the whole consequences. So in brain development, They did these really fun fMRI studies, functional MRI, where they looked at kids' brains and they asked them questions, and they looked at, adults' brains and asked them questions. Things were like, is it good to swim with sharks? Is it good to eat a salad? The teenagers all got it right. They knew it was not good to swim with sharks, they knew it was good to eat a salad, but they had to actually think about it. They looked in their brains and they could tell that they were actually thinking it through. Was it good to eat a salad, or was it good to swim with sharks? Adults, of course, can pick that out and don't have to actually think about it, but teenagers actually do have to think about it because they don't have enough life experiences to not have to go through all that, their brain. Their decision making also is very important, swayed by who's in the room with them. So if they're looked at some of these studies, if the popular girl, the good-looking popular girl, thinks it's okay to swim with sharks, everybody thinks it's okay to swim with sharks. Everybody in the room thinks that that's okay because the popular girl does. A lot of times these kids are trying to look cool because they want that reward center is there. And so sometimes they go along for the ride and do something so incredibly stupid. Of course, on paper, they'd be able to tell you what they're doing is not right or not good, but there's some problems with impulse control. So Brian Stevenson this is my final thought for you before I turn it over to questions. Brian Stevenson is the author of a book called Just Mercy and the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. If you haven't read this book, it's a really good book. You should get it. It's Just Mercy.
Would you repeat the author again?
His name is Brian Stevenson. And he runs a clinic in Alabama, does a lot of work on death row inmates and then also on children. He's one of the ones that had one of the lawyers that argued in front of the Supreme Court to get kids back into, not be sentenced to life without possibility of parole. But he always says when he talks about the death penalty, he always says we shouldn't ask the question, do they deserve to die? We should ask the question, do we as a society deserve to kill? Because we've made so many mistakes. His point is we've made so many mistakes over the course of the death penalty that we as a society have not earned our right to do that. We have made too many mistakes. And I think in the context of children as adults, it's similar. We have made a lot of mistakes on it. We don't have a way to figure out which kids really need to be there. We've grossly overused that. But the kids don't actually deserve it either because their brains are way underdeveloped. They don't lack some of the impulse control, so I think we should be able to keep them safely in the juvenile justice system and work on improving them so that they hopefully at some point in their lives lead productive. All right, I would love to questions. So, sure.
Speaking to the microphone, please. Yeah. We gotta flip that switch, it's in the screw.
So it's going, I can hear it, it's on.
It's good.
It was. Now it is.
Like this.
Hand it to you.
Thank you. I'm Lynn Wheeler, and I worked in the Department of Criminal Justice for 11 years, and I'm very, very much against making juveniles as adults. But my question is not the solution somewhere even beyond this, that when we take in these children and turn them loose, at some point, have we given them a good enough, not only rehabilitation in prison, but have we given them a good enough net safety, some kind of safety net, so that when they come out, they don't have to go back to the place that put them there.
Yeah.
And the other thing is I want to ask you what you think about the private prisons for these kids.
Okay.
What about 3 strikes?
Sure. Do you want me to ask one at a time?
Answer one at a time.
So we do not, we have historically not done a really good job at reentry, and lots of people are trying to work on that over the course because we recognize that we put kids in prison because we're trying to punish them. We're not trying to rehabilitate them. There's not a lot of rehabilitation going on in prisons. So we're trying to punish them, and then when they get out, they don't really know how to behave because they haven't had a lot of the skills that they need to learn. So there are lots of groups that are actually working on reentry programs, and they vary from low-level offenders to higher-level offenders, depending on who you are and what kind of group you know would work with you. So they are trying, and a lot of people recognize that this is one of the faults in our system, because once we started doing just punishment, we really kind of stopped doing the things we need to do about getting people, you know, back into society. In Germany, actually, it's very interesting. Once you finish your sentence in prison, no matter what it is, you come back out a full member of society again, where you're welcomed back in, and you have no real, you know, there's nothing on your record that would indicate that you've been in prison for 10 years or whatever. And people really, you really do get a second chance, and you really do get really welcomed back into society. Unfortunately, here in the United States, we are so angry about people that have been in prison, and we don't even want to give them jobs, and we really have been just really harsh on this. And so it's very hard. It's very hard for them to get education afterwards. So it's something that people are always working on, and lots of groups do it. I can give you lots of examples of really good groups that do it. Some states are much better than others, but everybody's trying here.
Is it called restorative justice?
Restorative justice is something, that they do, where they work, restorative justice is an issue where they try to work with victims in the communities to try and get everybody healed from a crime. Sometimes it goes a little overboard because the defendant doesn't get a lot of their rights when they do these restorative justice stuff, but usually it's trying to heal the community and heal the person and heal the victim so that they can kind of move forward, is what those are called. So
Thank you.
With regard to 3 strikes, did that ever turn out being an issue with any of the juveniles?
yeah, so the 3 strikes laws, every state does it a little differently, but lots of places do something where if you get in trouble 3 times, that's it, you're done, we're going to put you away, and you're going to serve a very long sentence, sometimes life, that's the possibility of parole after that. And they usually don't work very well, because what usually happens is somebody who did something terrible in the beginning, and then they do something very mild for their next 2, ends up going to prison for life. And so the 3 strikes rules don't work very well. And for the kids as adults, what has happened is that once you get charged as an adult, you're always going to be charged as an adult. So if you started off with a low-level drug offense, and then you had something even less, less minor than that, or more minor than that, you would end up going in and being charged as adults and having a longer rap sheet. Go ahead.
I just thought of a little solution. I'd like your opinion on it. If you find children getting out of control and beginning to get into the criminal element, why not, for the period from then up until about 25, when they get better judgment, just put them in a state of suspended animation?
Yeah, no, I've always argued that we need to, as kids, especially kids that get in a lot of trouble, we need to safeguard them until they're about 25, and somewhere put them, and then when they're 25, we can let them loose, right? Because then they should be okay.
If you've been able to sit down with a politician and explain your understanding of things, do they always agree with you, or do they maintain the, we're done with them, put them away?
Yeah, so I have had some really good luck with some politicians, and it is actually not, it's a very bipartisan issue, by the way. It is not one side or the other. I think it probably started off as being a very liberal issue, and not very many people would attack it, but it's both on the left and the right, where lots of people are coming together, because they see that we've done a lot of really terrible things over the course of how we've made a profit off of people that are going to prison. It's a very prison industrial complex. It's just a profit for a lot of people. So,
do you have an opinion on prisons for profit?
yeah, so I think somebody did ask that, I didn't answer that, and I'm sorry. Yeah, that is a really, it's a very terrible thing that we do for prisons for profit, but even our government-run prisons are profits for somebody, because it costs an incredible amount of money for offenders to call home, to buy TVs, things like that. We can't, we can, but it's not gonna get them to a better place in society if we just put them in a cell and give them no contact with the outside world, or give them no, sort of like outlet to do anything. If you don't have, no way you can send a letter home or get a letter from your family, you're not gonna go anyplace after that. So even our government-run prisons are profit centers for somebody, but our private prisons are actually really, really bad because we end up putting people there at somebody's expense, and we will just put more and more. And if a politician is funded by the private prison industry, they will always vote for more and more harsher laws and more ways to go down there. And so,
We're saying lots of free.
I don't know
I didn't get any money from those.
if the, in Texas, you said 17 years of age to an adult. How is it that they put younger people in prison then? Like today's paper had a young man who was arrested in Dallas, and he had sexually assaulted 2 people here, and they believe he's connected to a murder, and the DNA said he's wanted in Louisiana. He's 15 years old.
Oh, my God.
And they want to try it as an adult. How can they do that?
so that's just some of the laws here in Texas will allow kids charged with certain crimes to be charged as adults. Yeah, so it varies state to state, and I don't know what they're going to charge him with, but they can almost always get just about any kid they want to, they can charge as an adult. There's usually a blanket thing that, that any crime can be charged as adult if they want to. So.
Okay, and another thing is, do they still have 3 strikes? Because I know someone who's for the 4th time.
Yeah, so it depends on what the laws are in each state and where they are and stuff. So in Texas it just depends on what their first crimes were and all that. It really is. It's a complicated.
None of
It's not very easy to
it's all
comprehend.
It's all money. They can do what they want.
That's right.
Hardly consider it before they do the crime.
Yeah,
My question is, most of the individuals, most of the statements you made regard children who came from very, very poor backgrounds. Are there any indication when we have children from two-parent homes being caught in a similar situation?
Well, that is one of the things that when I first went down to Illinois, I was trying to explain how this was terrible and how, we wouldn't charge kids like this in the suburbs, and people that came from wealthier families, they had lawyers and stuff. They didn't like that, but it is true that what ends up happening is it's a 2-tiered system where people who have the money and can get lawyers, sometimes they end up your juvenile justice kids who should be charged in the juvenile justice system are instead in the mental health system because their parents can afford to send them to the mental health system as a circumvention of the juvenile justice system. But poor kids don't really have that option, and so we do have a 2-tiered system of justice where kids that don't have any money or access to anybody, even, there are public defenders that are incredible lawyers, but again, it also requires a different system, not just necessarily a good lawyer, but you have to have access to other courts.
You indicated some of the people that go to prison under these conditions are in there 30 years, and it's not rehabilitation. It's all punishment. When they stay in 30 years, aren't they pretty much locked into that kind of environment? They'll never make it outside.
yeah.
I think that's what a lot of people think. I've met some people that, I think are ready to come out of prison, and I've met some people who do come out and do well. They need to have a lot of, be able to be reintegrated into society at a specific, at a good level, right? They can't just come back, drop them off in the middle of where they were from, and then say, okay, have at it, good luck to you, because that doesn't work. So some places, like there's a group in Chicago that's actually working with these kids that are doing life without the possibility of parole, and they would send them. These guys will actually live in a place for probably 4 to 5 years, get job training, get all these things, because they do want to take some longer-term prisoners because they know that it's not doing well. There's some people here in Texas that are trying to start something similar out of Houston, where they're trying to work with some of these people that have been in for a really long time so that they can be reintegrated into society. It's very different. Prison is not, it's not a place you want to go, right? They're not, it's not I was lonely when I go. But they do have a, like your societal rules are not the same rules that you have on the outside. You trust nobody in prison. If you live like that out here, you end up, committing more crimes because you just have you're not, part of the society.
As was just mentioned here, this one child, 15 years old, apparently was caught sexually molesting a couple of people, and they had DNA evidence that he was part of some other crime, I think it was. So obviously the kid is dangerous. I mean, so what would you do with him?
Well, I don't know that I necessarily believe anything the papers say about what they're charging kids with, because I know.
Well, let's just say, for
But
instance.
let's say that it is true, so I'm not gonna, but let's say that this is true, there's lots of different places that you could do with that kid. Clearly, there are some kids that do need to be removed for some time because they're dangerous to us, right? We don't need somebody like that out there. So for sure, we think but there's lots of different places, and different ways you can take care of this without putting him in prison for forever, right? Or, like, again, my kid that was charged with sex offense, he went to a treatment center until he was 21 and he was never got in trouble again. So there are places that do work with kids who do things that are really outlandish too.
So the purpose you're thinking of is redemption.
Yes, absolutely. Because again, they're gonna most people that go to prison are gonna come out, right? It's very few people that are gonna stay in there for the rest of their lives. And so if they're gonna come out, we want them to actually be healed and, be able to have some sort of redemption.
Okay, well, when you brought up the issue, I'd like to get a more direct question to you on this. This is obviously a balance where you have some children who can be dangerous to society. Well, as a community, as cities, counties, don't we have a right to be able to protect ourselves from this danger of these children's behavior?
Oh yeah, well we do that, right? We do that, but we just go overboard. So we pretend like a lot of times these kids are way more dangerous than they are, and so we go overboard and try to protect ourselves in ways where it's actually harmful to all of us, even more so because we've locked a kid up in prison for so long that they don't know how to behave in society, then they come out and they commit more crimes.
A lady by the name of Joan Vion spent many years of her life studying the United Nations, going to all the conferences and so forth. And in 1985, in Rio, the UN came up with this idea of public-private partnerships. And that's why today we have so many private prisons. These prisons have no intention of rehabilitating people because they make money from the state by having people in prison. How can we get rid of this faction?
It is a really big problem, and the private prison industry is a very stronghold, I will tell you. I will tell you that private prison stocks, when the day after Trump was elected, private prison stocks rose real high. These people own a lot of these things, and so we have to get rid of some of these politicians who are in bed with the private prison industry, because that's where it is. And that's the only reason why we have half these laws is because they're able to, keep going down and passing laws because people are really funding them and making sure that they can.
Yeah, no problem.
Right.
Now,
I'm sorry.
Oh, the recent, there were, I don't know if this is prison or if this is detention. In Gainesville, the recent sexual abuse of minors who were incarcerated. Is that the prison system, the prison system?
So it happens everywhere. So kids, before you are detained in a detention center, before you are actually charged in court, and before you're actually found guilty, and then you could be sentenced to a prison. That's usually how it works. There's also detention centers that are immigrant detention centers down on the border that people are taking, people that are the immigrants that are coming over here. They're there. So those are called detention centers. But detention centers in the juvenile justice system are places that you go prior to being convicted, or if you're going to go for a short time. Similar to like a jail versus a prison. A jail is where you're held before trial or for just a short amount of time, all right, that's the
How
same
does
thing.
that?
And so they have lots of, I mean, many of these places are just very poorly run and very poorly monitored. We have all sorts of federal laws that try to protect prisoners from sexual assaults, but they're not very well implemented and they're not very well monitored. And so lots of people are really working towards that because there's incredible books out there by people who spent time in prison and these horrible, sexual assaults that occurred to them and, how bad it is to have this happen to you. It's not, none of these places are actually doing great on that, so.
Do you work with any of those?
I know who they are, yes, and so sometimes we end up working on certain issues together, so I do, they're very
I'd like your comment on a culture of disrespect among juveniles in our current day. I've observed twice where young people were sounding off at a cop, and I mean, it's a situation where you know this is not going to turn out well, and their expectation that they can do this is not correct. What is your response to that?
Well, I think kids in general, they think they can do a lot of things that they shouldn't do, and they don't recognize their brains are not necessarily developed. I'm not sure that it has changed much over the course of the last, 30 years. I think teenagers have always had disrespectful mouths.
I was an officer.
Yeah, I mean, they really do, that's kind of a teenage brain that they're not thinking through.
I was respectful, whatever I was doing.
Go ahead.
Well, one is I think they're modeling adults, because I work with adult males in maximum security. And I have to tell you, it's adult males that I came from that find that they're teaching their children this by just modeling it.
Yeah.
And we see it every day on the streets and in our news, every day on the streets and in our news, how people are treating the police. And don't get me wrong, I don't want police be disrespecting us either. It's gotta be two ways. And I don't know how you're gonna change that, because we are now a nation of rudeness. And I don't know what we're gonna change about that. The anger is terrible. What I wanted to really say though was, I don't know why, when we have these other countries that could be great role models for us, they don't have near the violence we have or the anger. Why can't we, there was I think it was Shanghai, no, not Shanghai. Anyway, there was a country that went around and checked everybody's insurances and whether they wanted universal health care or whatever it was that they wanted. They were investigating in all these different countries before they decided to put their own system in. And they took the best of each one they found, put it together, and now they have the best health insurance in the world. It is universal, by the way, but that's not the point. It's still health insurance. Why can't we do that with the systems that we go around and we look at those that are much more successful than we are and say, what are they doing that we're not doing, or what are they not doing that we are doing? And I suggest that we start showing, that we start putting pressure, that we send the people, like whoever's head of our judicial committees in the government or whatever, we send them out there and we expressly say, you have to find out what these people are doing, and you have to bring it back to the table.
So I think that there are groups that are doing that. I just recently heard of a whole group from Connecticut that actually went over, and I guess Connecticut and Massachusetts, they went over to Germany and several other places, Slovenia, and they went over and looked at a bunch of systems and trying to bring back, and they did a brilliant thing where they did bring people that normally, a politician that would not necessarily be on their side, they brought that person, they put a judge in there, they brought some police officers, and everybody came out of there and looked at it and said, okay, Germany, this is what we gotta go for, because these people are actually reintegrated into society right away, and they actually do well. And so they try to do those things on a very small scale right now. I think that we as United States citizens don't like to think that we're not the best at things, and we also have people that are making profits off of our prisons, and so it's really hard to get legislators to change things.
You won't get that till you get money out of politics.
Well, anecdotally, I actually talked to a person who was wrongly charged and ended up in a German jail, and he said those are the best jails in the world. If you're going to commit a crime,
Go there.
Do it in
go to Germany because the jails are so good. What's your comment on that?
Scandinavia
true. There's some nice places over, and some places you don't even know that they are jails, and so sometimes like that's, I mean, clearly some people should not be out and amongst us. We all agree with that. There are some people that are very dangerous. But, you know, we don't have to make it so it's so prison-like, because even those dangerous people in other places, when they live like they're not in prison, they still do well. They're still contained, but they're not.
Yeah, I did grand jury work, and I think they serve bologna sandwiches in the jails. John, that wouldn't agree with me too much. But anyway, they had a section I noticed for 17-year-olds. And you were saying that's such a critical age.
Yeah.
Yeah, but just think about conscience. Gosh, I can remember feeling guilty when I was 3 years old and even younger. So, do you think there's sort of self-penalty, this thing that children aren't aware of what they're doing is wrong?
No, I mean, I think that there's an issue, because most people know that things are wrong, and I don't think that that's like necessarily the way it happens. So they can, on paper, know it's wrong, you know, they can think about it through, but their impulsive acts kind of come in, is what the brain science would say. That they
Well,
come
actually,
to-
most teenagers, though, are fairly sociopathic, right? They want what they want right now.
Yeah, well, that is the thing, they want it and they want it now, and they don't know how to control that impulse to not get it right now.
I think that's a mimic of our society too, because we are, our general public wants what they want right now. It's adults.
Yeah.
And so we've got to find a way that we adults change how we act, if we want our children to act differently.
Think of that.
Not like those.
Dante, what role does poverty play in juvenile delinquency?
What role does the public play?
No, poverty.
Poverty, oh, I'm sorry. So again, there's a two-tiered system, so it doesn't mean that poor people are committing more crimes. It means that the poor people are actually getting charged more and getting into the prison system more than wealthier people are, because they are able to, you know, get higher attorneys and all that stuff. But again, poor, it doesn't necessarily have to do with, it's how they're charged, but nobody would say that poor people are committing more crimes. When they look at things like juveniles who will actually tell how much drug use they use, it's across the board, similar drug uses amongst races, amongst, you know, ethnic groups, and amongst, you know, wealthier to poorer classes. In fact, sometimes even wealthier people do more drugs, they just don't get caught, that kind of stuff.
We've had two major court cases filed in the United States under federal law on that exact issue. And guess what? Each time they both went and ordered, the federal judges ordered a long, extensive study of the people who they had found committing crimes under age X, whatever they designated at the time. And of course they were charged with disproportionately accusing the minority students of offensive illegal acts. In both cases, the accusation was 100% wrong. White kids are just as mean as black kids. Their daddies go down and rent a big room for them on the second floor of a building downtown, and they have a party down there, and they drug it and drink it and space the place out. So I'm just telling you, as a person who knows, not from having participated in it, but from working with the families whose kids do it, you know, they're just as bad. And it's even been taken through the courts. It's never been to the Supreme. Nobody's had the guts to appeal it to the Supreme, or the Supreme might not be willing to listen to it. But the supposition that we make that people of different ethnic origins are different, it's just like when you look at the Afro-American community. They use a different variety of cocaine than the white community uses. And the sentencing for the variety that the black community uses is more severe than the penalty for the type that the white community typically uses. That is unfair. That is wrong.
That's the difference between crack and cocaine.
Crack and cocaine.
They have fixed that now.
That is inequitable, they now seem to,
fix.
yeah, they seem to realize it, and they're going to work to fix it. But I'm just telling you that I would stake my life on the issue that the minority communities are not as more proponed to do that than the white communities who come from the same type of households. If you take a group of households who are made up with people that in 19-something or another you might regard as a typical American family, a man and a woman marry one another, they put a couple of dollars in the bank, they get a place to live, put some clothes on their back, and then they have their first child. Their first year income is over $30,000 a year, even if they're working on simple high school level minimum wage jobs. They are not in poverty. That's all it takes, but that does not happen on the south side of Chicago.
Is there a question?
Jim, you're in the comments period.
No, I'm explaining what the person asked back there.
But that's not your.
So I'm deviating from the program. This is a deviation.
It sure is.
But it's meaningless 40 minutes from now. So my question is the sky blue, is the grass green? Thank you.
In answer to whether people, I have to find a question here. I look at handwriting a lot, I'm an analyst, and most teenagers, though, do not have they don't have any upper strokes to speak of. A lot of them have no upper strokes. And the upper strokes show conscience. So if you don't have any upper strokes, you don't really have a strong conscience. That's why I was saying the teenage problem with what they want. They want it right now. But I don't know if anybody's observed that. In the analysis of these children, does anybody ever look at their handwriting?
I'm not sure.
Well, I would think that would be a standard assumption that that would be more of a childish trait to want something right now. And it does show up in the handwriting.
Right.
The question, are we as a country prepared to fund remedial action for these wayward teenagers who do get into trouble? Or is there another budget cut for that?
Well, we're currently, so we've been doing a lot of stuff where we work with kids who, are trying to improve the system, the juvenile justice system. So there's a lot of a push right now for people to actually do that kind of stuff. We're just working on it. So far, the pendulum is swinging backwards from our huge punishment era to try to get some kids some remedial and some, education.
Is what you said, this is a bipartisan issue, so does it make a difference that the Democrats have taken the House where the funding comes from?
But they do get to fund some things, so we'll just see what happens and we'll see what they do. They haven't necessarily, the entire caucuses of both the Republican and the Democrat don't necessarily all agree with me, but there are pockets of them that both agree with me. So we'll see what shakes down. I know. See.
So is it not true that there's been a general decline in crime over the years? And so presumably juvenile crime has decreased as well.
Absolutely, yes, that's correct, yeah.
But what you're saying is that with the declining crime, we've managed to increase the population in prisons.
Yes, yes.
So really what you're saying is the penalties have become much more harsh then.
Yes, the penalties have become much more harsh and they've made more and more things crimes and they just keep going because somebody's making a profit off these kids and somebody's getting reelected to go back down to Austin or whatever state, legislature. That's why they're doing it. They used to have this joke in our state capital in Illinois where the joke was that, we don't want to pass all the criminal bills because we got to save something for the next year. So they can pass a criminal bill and then those people get reelected.
I've spoken to police before, and I don't know if this is currently the case, but they don't have a whole lot of discretion if they witness a crime. And it used to be when we had community policing that the policemen really did have discretion whether someone was charged or whether they got a ride home to their parents.
Yeah. I think that sometimes it changes and it just totally depends on what area you're in, because some places still do, police still do, drive the kid home.
Are you an advocate for that?
It depends on what the crime is. I mean, obviously, like, there's sometimes, like, kids mouthing off to the police. That's like, clearly, some cops are gonna take that a little more seriously than other cops are. Hopefully, I've seen some kids where a kid was trying to commit suicide. He was a young child, like an 11-year-old, trying to commit suicide, trying to jump off a roof. And he went to grab the police officer, or the police officer went to grab him, and he kicked the police officer. And he got charged with assaulting a police officer. Well,
Oh, my God. Oh, my
the kid's trying to jump off the building, and he wants to jump, and so that kid needed to be the mental health system, not charged with battery or, assault on a police officer.
I just want to make a quick comment because I have to leave because I'm an environmentalist, so I'm riding mass transportation. I have to get on it to get back to Irving. When I retired from the prison, prison system, I helped open a home out in San Antonio in Bexar County for 24 women because I was interested in what do you do when they come out. And I had always worked with men in the prison. So I worked with this group and we opened a home for 24 women to come out and could stay up to 2 years. It wasn't one of those 6-month things, which many times does no good. And they could stay up to 2 years. They got education, we had teachers out there, we had a beauty shop they could help each other in. We had clothing that was donated that we fixed up for them to go look for jobs or go to school. We had, we did this for up to 2 years for 24 at a time. And some of them left earlier because they managed to get good jobs. We also helped them get children back when they were fighting for their children. We had lawyers. And I have to say that I don't think in the system I worked in, which was Texas, that I ever saw anything work any better than that. Because we didn't send them back home to where they got in trouble in the first place.
Right.
We put them in a place that was like a home as much as we could make it. Only 2 women to a bedroom, on their own baths and everything. And it really worked beautifully. So I think we should be doing this for our children that come out. I think we definitely should be doing it for the men that come out. Anyway, I have to
Thank you
go.
for your work. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Are we done with questions? In which case, those that like to get up and give 5 minutes of wisdom, how about it?
You know. I'm gonna make you. You know we're there.
Did it come up, girl?
I used to get up and show up these days.
Boy, wires everywhere. Watch it grow. Oh, I'm gonna say something about 2 topics. I keep the first one very short because I really wanted to be up here when the 3 people who just left the last table were still here. But I'll give you a real brief recap of it anyway. And that's about healthcare. And she talked about the people who were going to other countries and studying things that were being done. And as a CPA who majored in economics and history and then worked with many, many healthcare companies, from small ones up to some of the largest multi-hospital owning companies in the country, I don't know everything about it, but I assure you, I know more about it than the person walking down the street on the sidewalk at random. Johnny Carson would stick the microphone up in their face and ask them a question, and they would, And the fact is, healthcare in the United States, this is something that people in front of a microphone seldom say. It's not due to our healthcare system as much as it is to us and how we live. For example, I'll take the extreme example, and you can plot the others in between. You take the United States versus Switzerland. They bike it all the time. They walk up and down the steep hills all the time. They climb stairs in places we get mad if there's no elevator, right? So my point is, without, I don't have time to give a speech, which I could, but the point is, healthcare is very expensive in the United States for a lot of reasons, and a huge part of that is our form of life. We have too many alcoholics, we have too many in ill health. I'll give you a simple example. If you drive up North Highway 75, get off, and walk into a Walmart, which is a block off the street, and you look at the customers who are shopping in there, and you look at the employees who are stocking the shelves. You get back in your car, you drive back down Central to LBJ, you go around in a curve until you get into Southeast Dallas, and the first time you see a Walmart store, you get out and you go inside. A high percentage of the people working in the store are not very healthy looking. They are generally overweight. The customers, some of them are barely getting down the aisles, particularly with a cart going in two directions. You see them look at each other like, oh wow. So that really is an issue as to why our health care here in this country is so high. Zip, shut that off. I'm going to say a couple of words about our speaker, who's very well informed and very well spoken. I know enough about what she talks about that I understand every word that comes out of her mouth, and it's very well spoken. You've taken it very well. To me, as a person, the biggest problem we have here in the United States in dealing with that issue, other than being an emergency room technician, at the time the bad event occurs in the 16-year-old's life. That's bad. But guess what? 16 years have already gone by. And our culture has evolved a great deal over a period of time, from the point of generally being made up of what I said a few moments ago when I was supposed to be asking a question and I was responding to the person who was getting ready to leave. And that is, it's made up of a male, a female who marry, have jobs, and start a family. And they're making $32,000. In downtown New York City, that's struggle. That's bad news. In Boise, Idaho, it's heaven. And so that's very different in different parts of the country. So you can't, a country has 320 million people, you cannot make a single statement about anything like that that applies to everyone, because it don't. But the fact is, it's not that we're encouraging it overtly, but we're encouraging it covertly by instituting special benefits for parenthood. So you can't have children without ever having a spouse, I think it's up to 3 now maybe, and get assistance in doing that. That's not going to help you live the good life, but it's going to keep you from starving. And that is not a discouragement to that act. In 1948, people didn't dare do that act, because until Lyndon Johnson began to put practices into place at the federal level that plowed federal money out into individuals' hands, you could not function if you were not a functional family. If you didn't make enough money in your first job, you lived at home in your parents' basement. In Chicago, in Dallas, you lived in the garage apartment, the garage, or you went and rented with 3 other people down on Gaston Avenue an apartment, and you each paid about $50 a month. And you had a job downtown at a bank or insurance company, and you squeaked it by. So that was a very different situation than a young woman who is 21 years old, has 3 children by 3 different male parents, and she couldn't even tell you who they are in some cases, maybe at least one of them. That is a very difficult thing to solve. You have a very hard problem to deal with, because it starts long before you ever get into the picture. And a lot of those things have already been put in place, and you have to try to work them back out so that they can try to function as a functional adult in our American society, which is fairly free. And I hope you're very successful in doing that. You've taken on a big task, and I admire you for doing it. I just wish we could go all the way back to the start line and do the kickoff. Pardon my stumbling, but the wires are out.
I would like to thank the speaker for this topic. It's something that I've thought about and haven't said anything about it, haven't done anything about it. I want to say at the front end, I know we live in fear of a lot of things. People are criminal in nature. We have a certain kind of attitude, and we think punishment is what's required.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the best tool. But the other thing is, I want to think of it. She had a young 16-year-old man that proposed to her, and she still communicates with him, but she didn't marry him. So so that's what it is. The thing I look at is America to me is where I've been. I'd rather be here than be anywhere else, but that doesn't mean we're perfect. A lot of the problems we have in America, we created through policy. And just like you said, private prison. If you look at the history of Texas prison system, you will see it's been in trouble a lot of times. We've had a total private system. It was totally corrupt. And in the 60s and 70s, it was under the jurisdiction of the federal court for about 10 or 12 years because they were so bad. And now we have private prisons. Many of us misunderstand that, private operations are not, in some cases, not the most efficient operations. And if you have a private prison system, they got to make a profit. And someone's going to hurt as a result of that. And so that's the problem. We say state people or federal public employees are lazy. Well, I worked for 29 years. They're not all lazy. And probably more lazy than we are in private industry. But the state could really do it cheaper than anyone else. They don't pay the highest salaries and the highest benefits. And if you go to a private entity, they're more prone to do that. So we created, and we have other issues that are just perception we have of poor people. And we have a two-tier system. It's not only with juveniles, but it's with adults.
Yep.
We have a two-tier system. You can hire a company attorney. You have the money to do that, you're going to be all right. You depend on a court appointed attorney, you're in trouble. So most of those cases solved through plea bargaining. And so that's why our system corrupt. But if we had a situation, one thing with the welfare system, and I know I'm over 5 minutes already on it soon. In Texas, if you were an intact family, you couldn't draw benefits.
Right.
And so that created an opportunity for people, if they were married and wanted to stay married, they couldn't. Because during the Depression, they'd have to leave home for their family to eat.
Yep.
And we maintained that program because many people felt that it's only poor people in the program, only African American minorities. But you have more whites getting food stamps than number-wise than blacks, not ratio-wise, but number-wise. And when we start looking at it, if people knew it costs about $55 a day to keep someone in prison. We don't mind paying that, it seems, but we don't want to come up with education to educate people. Part of the problem is in education. And a bigger part is like what he was alluding to. If you don't have a mother and a father to teach you, to help you and guide you, you're working at a disadvantage when you get out in the world. So those are the kind of things I argue about. It's essential for children to have a mother and a father. One parent can't be, a father can't be a father and a mother. A mother can't be a father and a mother. You can only be one. And so we look at those things, maybe we can fix the system. And that's why I asked the question I knew what the difference were. It's a two-tier system. That's why I asked the question. So ordinarily, if everybody was treated the same, those people, two-parent families, they would be joining with you to bring solutions. Thank you for your presentation.
Well, Thursday evening late, I missed a meeting, but there were still a couple of people hanging around. And so I was talking to him outside, and one of the characters was regaling this student teacher that he worked with from Cuba. And he had all kinds of harrowing stories of getting out of Cuba back in a time when it was really dangerous. But the guy came in as a student teacher, and for some reason he got directed to the problem children class. And so he went in there, and everybody was, talking around and so forth for a while, and he said, "Okay, time for everybody to sit down." And one of the students mouthed off to him and talked about performing a sexual act on him, and he just took the guy by the neck, moved him up the wall a little bit off his feet with one hand, and said, "Who's going to do who?" And all of a sudden the class was very, they were all behaving, and they were all listening to his stories, and they're all sitting there very calmly with their hands almost in a prayer position there. And the kids actually enjoyed having him for a student teacher. They wanted him back. The principal wanted him back, and of course he'd broken every rule in the book. But he just demonstrated who the big dog was. Yeah. And a lot of times, a lot of these kids have just never had somebody really spell it out to them, and that's an issue. One other issue as far as organized crime does use minors. I know I had a salesman who came to work for me, a young man who really seemed to know his way around things and was getting customers, and I'm paying him commission. And he finally opened up to me, and he said in his youth he'd been a drug mule, and he had more airline miles than most businessmen. And I mean, he was just getting on the airplane, carrying, usually like a gym bag or something like that. And he's carrying large amounts of things. And of course, he had a handler, and there were overtones of maybe some kind of abuse or something like that. He got free from that situation when his overweight handler got his stomach stapled, and then went and ate ice cream and bled to death. He had a hemorrhage, but he didn't have self-control, and he bled to death. So that was one story, but that's organized crime using youth, and it went on a lot in the 80s. There was a lot of that in the 80s, and I presume it's still going on. Then there's the other aspect of, I worked for a very short time with a gentleman by the name of Jerome Heckenkamp, and I'm up in Greenwich, Connecticut, and we just finished a production, and the main guy decided that, in fact, the conference we had just spent a week videotaping was a little too controversial, and so he was like, well, we're going to have to just, we can't do this. So he had Jerome come in, and I'd helped some of the presenters there with their slideshow, their PowerPoints, and so Jerome sits in in 2 keystrokes, he's into a level of my Macintosh I've never seen before. It's like command level, and he's just working on hard drives and everything like that. I couldn't help myself. I just said, only hackers do that. I found out when I went and looked him up later, after I'd worked with him for a while, that in fact he had been in federal prison for being a hacker when he was in college. His name was Jerome Heckenkamp. I just was very sad to learn he died in 2016 from health problems, which could have been related to his time in federal prison. His sister didn't say he had AIDS, but he had some kind of blood disorder, and it's very, it's very disturbing. But a young talented guy. He was actually assistant producer on the movie Apocalypto. And then he went ahead and died in 2016. But it's a case where you got someone who he was prosecuted as an adult. He was put in an adult prison. And actually, the last year and a half of his sentence, he had some people campaign to release him to house arrest, and he spent a year and a half with Hutton Gibson. So, under a judge's order. So they got him out of federal prison, they just didn't get him out soon enough. Anyway, that's my word.
Well, I had a friend who did 5 years in a private for-profit prison, and he had some very definite thoughts about it. They were not there to really help or do justice. But anyway, my fundamental point is that our society needs to make a clear, well-delineated distinction between functions that private businesses can do best and functions that government does best. And I fully agree with you that for-profit prisons are not a good thing. That is a function, justice is a function of government, not business. Justice should not be something that people make a profit from. Matter of fact, it should decidedly not be profitable. So I guess that's my fundamental thought. Now, there's some things like military justice and like regulation of business, things like that, that rightfully belong in the government sphere and should be kept there and should never be allowed to become a for-profit enterprise.
What Ken just said reminded me of when prisons become privatization, people become commodities. And
Amen.
the disease he might have had was Hep C. A lot of prisoners have Hep C because of tattooing and other things. My comment is about, again, private prisons. When I did go to Brownsville last summer and for the migrant protest, and they were talking about private prisons, and I looked it up when I got back, and the trend had been President Obama was going to eliminate them because they had so many violations, violence, contraband, guards being shot. And so the current president in his campaign went to the owners of the private prisons in Texas and told them he would double their population. And immigrants are being sent there. People who come back a second time, immigrants are being sent there. And I don't know the distinction I know that some of the prisons in Texas are private. Is that separate? I guess that's another question. Is that separate from those prisons? But it said they were not employing any of the community to work in the prison, so it was not helping the community as some of the prisons do. I know there's a prison in Palestine, and they say everybody that lives there works there, and that's giving jobs, but these private prisons are not. They're just taking the money and they're having immigrants do the work. And so they're just taking the money and they're not helping anybody. But that is another question maybe you can address when you rebut. Are those the same in the same system or not? Thank you.
Who's got notes? Morning.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation, I think. I think one of the biggest problems that we have, that I've of course mentioned before, is greed and lust for power. And the biggest way to make money in this world that I know of is war and then rebuilding after war. And that's all private money. We think it comes through the government, it's all private money. And that money is all supplied by the international banking system, of which all major banks, except for a few like Russia and Hungary and Iceland now, are part of. And that is the largest criminal organization on earth. And we need to address that and go back to constitutional money, which is asset-backed, which Gaddafi was doing, and that's why he was destroyed, because of the banking system. I didn't mean to get onto that, but it keeps coming up. Drug trade in prisons is huge. The largest trader of drugs in this world is our Defense Intelligence Agency. That's what the Vietnam War was all about. And the second largest part of that is the military intelligence service. Those are the two biggest parts of the drug trade. And even like what George Bush Sr. had, what was it, Zapata Oil Company, an offshore drilling company?
Yeah.
Well, the workers get on the helicopters or boats and they fly out to these offshore platforms. They're not going out of the country, so they're not examined when they come back in. And when the boats go out there, they're not examined. And the helicopters, they're not examined. But in the meantime, on all those Zapata rigs, ships were coming in or boats were coming in and offloading drugs that were transported into the United States. We have politicians who are more corrupt than we want to admit. And we think that, oh gosh, they say, oh honey, we'll do this for you, I believe in that thing, and so forth. They couldn't give a damn. They're not going to get into office unless they have big money behind them. And that means they're playing the game. I don't care how nice they seem to you. And they keep us divided into Republican and Democrat and left and right and all kinds of other things, just so we're fighting with each other and missing the big picture of what's going on in this world. All of humanity is tremendously manipulated. And these people are sociopathic, the leaders. Most of the upper crust leadership in this world, I know you're not going to believe this, a lot of people, but study it. They're satanic. They actively believe and practice in Satanism. And this converts that mentality into a sociopath. A lot of our political figures are that way. I would say all of the royal families are that way. It's beyond the imagination, but when you really begin to get into it, you can find the evidence of it. But another thing I have mentioned before several times is Yuri Bezmenov, B-E-Z-M-E-N-O-V, a Russian KGB defector who was involved in trying to convert India to communism back in the communist days. And he stated that the first step in converting a country to communism is to tear down the moral fiber. And he said when they started in on the United States, they allowed 15 to 20 years to do this. They were astounded that in this country it only took 10 years. I was sitting at a restaurant the other night with some guys, some friends, and this young man and his girl walked by and he drops a napkin down beside me and they kind of giggle and hang out there at the door looking at my response to it. He had drawn a male penis and the testicles and liquid coming out. And the two of them were laughing at that. These are morally degenerate children. And that is largely what we have in this country today. I go to these restaurants and I see kids doing things and dressing ways and acting in ways that are so rude and so crude that I'm just astounded. I would have had the reddest fanny in the world if I'd been like that when I was a kid. And I think these need to have it too. We're going along with all of this stuff about, what's the terminology about you can't say this about them and so forth.
Politically correct.
Yeah, politically
PC.
Yeah. We're being brainwashed into this garbage. Let's go back to our original roots. What does our Christian background of this country mean? It is so broad that it was not defined by our founding fathers as Christian, but as godlike. All men are created equal. Now that's beautiful to me.
First Amendment.
That's right. I'm finding that if there's anything that I see, we need to, number one, get rid of that banking system that has supported both sides of every major war we've ever had and is still doing it. And we need to get rid of the educational system as we have and go back to a system where the communities govern those systems and see that they're teaching children properly. Go back to teaching analytical, critical thinking rather than just being trained to be drones fit in that slot or that slot or that slot. A lot of this stuff is coming out of the United Nations. Personally, I have felt for years the United States needs to get out of the United Nations and get the United Nations out of the United States. The globalists are the worst threat to humanity in all of our time. And these big international treaties, like they were proposing the TTP, to join all the Asian nations and the Americas together in this big, no longer would our courts count because they have their little councils. Nothing would go into our legal system anymore. One of the very best legal systems, that in the British system, that we've got in this world. And they want to eliminate that. They want total dictatorship. All of the countries in the EU are not represented. Those people are all appointed and given nice salaries and all of that. They don't represent those countries. And look what they've done to them with immigration. They practically destroyed Europe. And thank God that Trump has the idea of build that wall and keep them out, because that was bringing nothing into this country that would better our form of moral, I almost said degeneration, but that seems to be what's happening. Anyway, those are a few of the issues I think we really need to develop. The prison system needs to be more like the German system, I would say, in that people need to be trained into the qualities of life that count, into the moral fiber of life, and into respecting your neighbor as yourself. And if they see that some of these people are sociopathic or psychopathic, they probably cannot be healed. Some people are born that way, and it's just a deficiency in their structure. And these people probably do need to stay confined and watched all the time. Anyway.
Well, Albert didn't make the announcement when he mentioned George Bush. A very evil man died yesterday. That was George Herbert Walker Bush. And some people might take me for a conservative, but believe me, he really didn't have conservative values if you study him, if you study what he did. And, well, the prison system is, we've had presidents who are heavily involved in the prisons. And I would probably get in trouble here if I mention which president is most heavily involved in the prisons. But I'll give you a clue, is I believe that president passed the 3 strikes rule. I'll leave it there.
Bill Clinton.
Two paper clips and I'm motor. Oh, Lord.
Actually, I just have a few reflections, really. Really what crossed my mind, really, when hearing, really there seems to be a lot of angst about. It really does seem to be like a degeneracy of social values and of social mores, actually.
Yep.
And what I have explanations, but it's basically socio-economic, what's going on. There's a lot of very unhappy people. And I think that, as somebody said, by and large, the people that pull the strings don't give a damn about America or anybody else, as long as they can do what they want to do. And I think what you have seen is an increasing number of what's called the precariat. In the old days, people would join a company and they had lifelong employment. And also it was stable employment, and together with that there were stable benefits and pensions and so forth. But what you do see is all that's been wiped away. There is no stable jobs, there's no stable pension plans, and of course many times what is there, it was just stolen. In fact, just today, I read that the hedge fund manager that took over Sears and Toys R Us, actually was actually asset stripping the company. And the parts that, for example, like Craftsman Tools, he sold that part to himself, okay? And Kenmore and so on. I mean, these people have just, this is actually, so what you see is you have a system that actually destroys wealth, not creates wealth. And I agree with Albert. I mean, you have a financial system really that's run amok. And really this is because of this elimination of regulations and so on. And these people that run stuff, as I say, they're just immoral people. And apparently immorality pays, it seems, because this has proliferated. It's got worse and worse and worse. And of course this crash in 2008 was just another, culmination of the same thing. I mean, as Jim and I were talking coming over about, this crash happened, and of course people get unemployed, they can't pay their mortgages, and of course the mortgages were repossessed by these banks. And of course it's not only in America. The Royal Bank of Scotland actually was, they actually were preying on companies that were going through hard times. Instead of helping them, they were asset stripping, closing them down, to make profits, while accepting government money into the bargain. And so I do think there's sort of a spiritual sad, morass actually about people. The old values that I grew up with, which everybody, I mean, we had 1% unemployment in the 50s in England. I mean, everybody went to work. You had good jobs and they were reasonably well paid and so on, even though we were still recovering from the war. You had the surety of existence, but that surety of existence has gone out the window. And so I think that really that's now, I don't really subscribe to any particular party. I think they're about as bad as each other. I think the problem is that the good people get corrupt. It's like bad apples, One bad apple in the Senate or just corrupts everything there. But the biggest corrupting factor is his worship of money. And of course this private prisons is just another example of that. I mean, it's obscene to have an industry based on locking people up and actually making more profits by locking more people up for even flimsier excuses, even though we know the crime rate has actually gone down. And so, these are many, so you have social problems, but of course it's bound up with economic problems as well. And I think there's a sadness in this country. I think people realize that things have gone off the rails. And I'm afraid we don't have a leader that is about to put things back on the rails. If not, his incivility and lack of restraint of what I would call social values in discourse is really alarming, I think. And whatever good he was purportedly going to do, has been negated by his incivility and lack of just common decency. It's that really, I think. It's really this looking after your fellow man, realizing that when you look after your fellow man, you're looking after yourself. And that's what gets lost. And to me, it's not surprising that the young look at all these fine examples and say, well, to hell with it, I want mine now then. And of course they're immature. That's what, teenagers do get into trouble. And, they do off the rails, and they need to be nurtured. Our young people, after all, it's the country's future. And so I think the whole society needs to be healed, actually. So I'm very sad for it because, when I came, it was a whole different place. 50 years ago, it was a whole different place, actually. And so we need to get back to some of that. And you can't decry, good society. I mean, these things are necessary, but we really do need to have better job creation, better situations for the lower echelon, actually. Anyway, I commend the speaker very well. I think she put her case extremely well. I do think that it really amounts to having a moral values. Actually, we say we have a constitution and we're God fearing and all the rest of it. Well, we need to put that into practice, really, about how we treat our most vulnerable citizens, our children. And so, anyway, it makes me sort of sad to observe this, and I hear the angst that you hear coming from your comments, actually. I personally don't know what to do. Actually, I try to be friendly and cast some balm on the system wherever I can. But it is difficult, actually, because a lot of people, it's gotten worse over the last 2-3 years, I think, because I mix with, the Hispanics and the poorest echelon of society. And it's definitely got worse, actually, this last 2-3 years. And it bodes ill for the future, actually, unless we change the track in this country.
This is one of those rare nights when we get away. Sometimes I do some of the introductions so I don't feel so guilty about doing it twice. First of all, I'd like to, again, compliment our speaker. I'd like to qualify some of the things I said before, and I know because of the tone of my voice, they quite often sound quite more harsh than I mean them. And I would just say this in a real simple way. I grew up in what would be south side of Chicago. I grew up in South Dallas as a young child. My neighbors across the alley were Afro-American. About a third of our community was Jewish, Temple Emmanuel. So I grew up in Dallas in an unusual situation, and it was very multicultural, not just like the Polish ghetto outside Chicago, where I used to work with a lot of them. And so I saw a lot of that. But I really thoroughly understand from being around those people, being as a white boy, excuse me to say it this way, being chased down the street by the 4 black kids throwing rocks at me out of their gravel driveways. I experienced discrimination, racial discrimination. They were calling me those names I won't repeat. Before I ever even thought about being negatively discriminatory toward people of another race. I loved them. In fact, when I became an adult, I used to enjoy taking several friends down into that neighborhood. On Saturday night, we would park outside one of the churches where they would have Saturday night church and get them to listen to the flavor of the church service. And the choir would be swaying to the left and to the right in their rows. or the preacher would be delivering that, at least vocally, dynamic monologue, you know, up at the pulpit. And they were just in awe. You'd see their mouths hang open. They'd never been around that culture. So I know our cultures are quite different. If you get in the car and drive up Preston Road, and you find what I call an enclave, that is a brick-walled community with a gate that you can only open with your, what's like your garage door opener, and you go inside, those families are all homogeneous. They're all upper income. A good percentage of them have inherited money from their parents. They have absolutely no exposure or knowledge of the community I just described that I grew up and around with. I feel so privileged. I feel so sad for people who grow up without the advantage of having a good, full, healthy family to show them what is right and what's wrong by their own examples. I'll shut up real quick. I had one friend who I grew up with lifelong. We were in the nursery beds together, the female. Anyway, she married a good guy from Fort Worth, and the four of us, my wife and I, her husband and I, became best friends and went out to eat every week. So as you can imagine, we exchanged a lot of tales. She was a home ec teacher for the Dallas Independent School District. Her last job at the last high school she worked in, I can still remember her sitting at the dinner table at the Italian restaurant on Gaston Avenue, telling me about her student body of girls. They all had at least one child. 3 or 4 of them were pregnant. She had taken each one of them who did not have a job out and roamed them around in her car and found them a part-time job so they could stay in their household and go to school. Now, to me, that is caring.
Amen.
I mean, I could cry, literally, to see the sympathy and the empathy that existed in Mary Beth's life. And then she would tell me on another night at a dinner about being called down to the principal's office about some student she had disciplined in the class. And here was the angry mother, not the father ever, the mother sitting there. The moment she would walk into the door, the mother would break out into expletives non-stop. And when Mary Beth would go back to the classroom to try to teach, you know, she would feel like a glob of mud on the ground. She'd been worked over. And the assistant principal did not have the gumption or the guts, the womanhood, the manhood, I don't care what you call it. She did not have the gumption to stand up to the parent who had no vague idea what went on in that classroom because they were not there, and just roast the teacher to a crisp over what their own child had done. So I know the child who grows up without adequate parenting, and I don't care what the reason for it is. You can have 2 lousy parents in the same household. You can have some households who don't have married parents because of federal benefits. I understand all that. I've done all that. But the fact is, we do have it, and I admire anybody who's got the guts to take it on after it's already occurred in a negative event. So thank you so very much for doing what you're doing. Boy, that fire
I think that wraps it. So, please, no, go ahead and make your.
I was just gonna say,
final-
thank you,
final
thank
comment.
you, that was very fun, I was very nervous, I hope I didn't miss out too. It was very fun, and I appreciate all your comments back.
We won't kill you.
All your really good questions, so, thank you, I enjoyed myself very much. I hope you guys will remember that, this year, when we try to raise the age to 18, that you guys will support that. And
Yeah.
there's stuff we can do to help the communities that are being affected by the business